weight. So something that I kind of always just a question that I always ask myself when I was training and trying to handle that for my own training camps. And now that I work with athletes, I try to do, the best I can with this, but it's, how do I, what would you say is the best way to get an athlete coming in with a very, low glycogen saturation, or even try to mitigate that depletion of glycogen for a sport that is this heavily glycolytic? Are you looking at more nutritional factors, or are you looking more at metabolic factors and how you're training that from a conditioning standpoint? Or what's your take on that?
I think that at the onset of every athlete's journey, there has to be some form of precision nutrient assessment, right? So there are a couple of ways to do that. If you have a trained nutrition professional, they could actually just see that from a nutritional history. There's a model that we use when I was training back in Master's Nutrition School at Bastyr. We used the ABCDs of nutritional assessment. So you look for anthropometrics, how the body's body compositions and whatnot. Right now, we have the luxury of using body composition analysis. So you have fat percent, muscle mass, bone density, even just by standing on those, the machines, the two circuit or one circuit machines. So that's the first segment. The second component, the letter B, is called biomarkers. So these are blood samples, urine samples, or even stool samples to understand digestive function. You're able to understand nutrients free flowing within the cell or in the bloodstream. And those are two different compartments, right? So the bloodstream is different from a cellular saturation. And so you would then have a more advanced type of biomarker called functional markers, where when the metabolic system of your cells start churning, if you lack a nutrient, they start to create certain chemical signatures. And so one example of that is methylmalonic acid. So if you see methylmalonic acid, you test for it in the urine, you see it elevated, that's a sign of a B12 deficiency, functional B12 deficiency. So you can have a high B12 in the serum, in the blood, but if methylmalonic acid is still elevated afterwards, then that person would have a functional deficiency. And so then the whole picture of nutrition starts to become, I guess, for a normal guy, it becomes pretty complicated, because then they would start asking their doctors, "Doc, you're saying I keep taking my B12, but it's not working." Then at that point, we start asking, all right, why is it not working? Is the B12, and we're just talking about B12 in this instance, is B12 then overutilized, or do you have any genetic issues using the B12? And that's where kind of the nutrigenomic aspect comes in. We can touch on that later on. We have about 40 minutes, an hour to talk about this. Letter C is clinical history or clinical diagnosis. Whenever a patient has pains, a patient has, I guess, history of chronic illness, there are nutrient classes that are known to be deficient in certain conditions. So you can pinpoint that aspect. The other, letter C, is actually clinical examination. And so we do in functional medicine, in the training we get pretty good training in a nutritional physical exam, which is a skill set that I think everyone should know, to be honest, even trainers and nurses and whatnot, because you can actually pick up zinc deficiency from the nail beds, or vitamin C or iron deficiency from the pallor in the eyes. You just have to be trained to kind of see, all right, is this pallor? Is it a white spot in the nail? And see those different images. And as you keep looking at nails, you'll keep understanding, oh, you can pick it up actually from a physical exam. And then the last one is diet history. So in the absence of the ABCs, let's say I'm not seeing my patient, I see my patients mostly online. I don't get to do a physical exam. I don't get to do my biomarkers right now because of the COVID lockdown. I rely on diet history. And so if I look at the diet history, and typically people will eat the same way, right? I mean, if you're eating a certain hamburger that you like, you'd be eating it for the next kind of 5 or 10 years if you live in the same place. And so you can project nutritional adequacy or deficiency from a diet history. It's not as precise, but you can get a lot of information just by tracking patients. And so from your your, I guess, premise when you started with, all right, so we have um, athletes needing a lot of glycogen. My question would then be, knowing that glycogen is what we need, how are they processing glycogen in the system? If you're giving them a mostly fat-centric diet, do they have enough carnitine, magnesium, zinc? Do they have enough I believe it's B5 to start cutting up the fatty acid chains? The other elephant in the room, and sorry, and cut me, guys, anytime you want me to stop. The other elephant in the room is that most of us are born with different microbes in our guts, right? So dependent upon where you were born in the world, so we live in a pretty global world, the microbes that are passed on from your mom to you are different. And so because of the change in the microbes, we will process food differently. That's just clear. So apart from a genetic processing capacity, nutrigenomic capacity for body, there is a microbial capacity that you now have to develop with certain foods. And so I'll give you an example. In Southeast Asia, or in the Philippines at the very least, I do a lot of stool testing. I test a lot of microbiome. Probably in the past 4 years, I've tested more than 300 stool samples. We've collected more than 300 stool samples. We look at the poop, we send it to the US, they culture it, run it through these DNA PCR machines, look at all the microbes inside. And what we're seeing is that when my patients are coming from we call it the rice and meat diet. It's a very local way of eating. So because we were colonized by the US, and every country that was colonized gets a taste of processed food and canned goods and all that stuff. So we started to develop after World War II a history of eating rice and corned beef, rice and spam, rice and all these canned goods. This now, what I'm seeing is there is a development of certain bacteria because of that diet. And because of that, most of my patients who are prone to getting autoimmune disease develop certain bacteria like Klebsiella, they get Citrobacter. Apart from that, we also get a lot of antibiotic intake when we were children. They're not as strict at regulating antibiotics in the country. And so as you give antibiotics, you knock out a lot of the bacteria. Think of it like you're giving a nuclear bomb to an entire area. And so the ones that survive, the cockroaches that survive, will start to multiply. And so what's left in the gut are those cockroach-like bacteria that survive the antibiotics. And so those now start to thrive with processed food intake, high sugar diets. And you have to knock them out to get the kind of the clean ones in. So I hope that starts kind of we get the ball rolling. Does it make sense? Do you have any questions about what I just shared?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is just, making sure that whatever we're going into the weight cut with or alterations in the diet, that we kind of have a better picture of what the athlete or the client is kind of able to process the best, or what may be even limiting, full absorption of the diet they're already taking currently, right?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, when you are, in a calorie restricted environment or in a carbohydrate restricted environment, especially for these athletes, they're trying to get off those last few pounds, glycogen, that early depletion stage of glycogen, that carries a lot of water weight with it. So a lot of athletes really, they tend to go the low carbohydrate route when they're trying to make those last couple pounds. What would you say then is a good kind of maybe a good method or a good tool that an athlete or a coach can utilize in those last couple weeks where they're very, very low on carbohydrate intake to still show up to competition time without the down regulation in the central nervous system that we'll see with their glycogen levels, without some of the adverse effects on hormonal levels, maybe, if there's anything that they can do to mitigate that.
Super interesting question. I think the key would then be to understand what energy source are they using during that time frame. So typically when you run patients in a very low carb diet, it would now, where are you going to get the calories from? Are you putting in more protein or putting in more fat? If you shift them into a higher fat diet, which a lot of athletes kind of do now, I guess, I would suggest getting a keto meter and getting into that zone of good ketotic state. And that, at least you're sure that you're metabolizing energy the right way. if you go on a high protein diet, chances are some of the protein won't get digested and absorbed. So there is a limit to the absorption of protein in the system. And mostly actually protein in the body is recirculated and recycled. We don't really take a lot of protein, but we do get a couple of grams of the essential ones that our body doesn't produce. And so that's where I think the balance would be. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any protein test, rather, apart from doing like a serum total protein kind of level or a urine protein test. The one of the ways that I think one of my teachers taught me before was a urine dipstick. As you do a urine dipstick, so urine dipstick is looking at urine, obviously, and looking at the proteins in the urine. And in the urine dipstick, you'll know if the urine is more acidic or more alkalotic. And I think there's also a urine dipstick that picks up on protein levels. And so if this patient is urinating protein, then you know that the protein intake is too much.
Yeah.
At least that's a
Okay.
pretty good metric objectively. But if you're trying to go with feel, I think that history is always the best way. So if he's gone on competition before, then you know how the body kind of adapts to these types of changes. I don't know if my answer really helps.
Actually got a question. I mean, most of the fighters you're talking about, Mateo, are going to be low carb, but isn't that counterproductive for performance if it's such a high glycotic activity? I mean, I know that it helps you lose weight, but in essence, it's like you're taking away the fuel that's the primary fuel for the activity. Like I understand like the logic of it, but in essence, like to me, it seems like in the long run, there's some like negative effects of doing that process. You know what I mean?
May I ask a question?
And if I could add something to that real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I guess to add to that question, something that would be interesting would just be for me knowing what you think, how flexible it is for an athlete to go in and out of that state. So for example, if I'm, seeing that I'm a little bit heavier than I would normally be, and I have 2 weeks left. So I try to make the switch to a higher fat diet, maybe try to gear some of my training to be more aerobically centered. Am I going to efficiently make that transition in time, or am I going to start seeing some of those detrimental effects on my performance? And then if I wanted to switch back, or if I wanted to carb load maybe night before or day of the competition, would I be able to see some of that, I guess that switch to a glycolytic metabolism start to happen? Yeah. I guess if that's tied into the kind of the detrimental effect that Ira was talking about.
Yeah, I actually wanted to kind of, if there's a question in my mind, and just to clarify kind of the situation, how many days before the competition do the athletes weigh in? Would you?
So there's two, so that we know, because we're two different things. So he deals a little bit more with like MMA. MMA is usually like a day or two, right? Mateo?
You get about 36 hours in MMA and jiu-jitsu.
So immediate. It's right before.
Immediate.
Yeah.
Immediate is the most common, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so interesting, because we know that the energy system in the body, if you're in a starved state, will shift into the fatty acid system within, I believe it's 36 hours.
Okay.
So if you're on there's a time frame for switching. And so I haven't worked with athletes. You might have more info on this, but from a scientific perspective, then if you could time the switch, right? You could, if you hit them to hit ketosis, high fat diet, which is a pretty low carb diet, hit ketosis, and then weigh, and then right after that, you start to shift them out of ketosis, then they may have a lot of glycogen stores for the competition prior. My only concern, well, for medically though, when I work with overweight patients and I want them to go on a ketogenic diet, we shift them for 2 weeks. And so what we've experienced clinically is that when you put a patient on a ketogenic diet for 2 weeks, they will switch, the cellular signals are changed, and then we go off of a heavy ketogenic diet. So our ketogenic diet would be about a 60% fat, 20% carbohydrate, 20% protein. After the 2 weeks, we push them off. So we put them on a 40% fat, 30 carb, 30 protein. And that's more maintenance type of ketogenic. then we
Okay.
see what the long-term effects of the first 2 weeks are. Genetically, we see switching. And so this is a, I think you mentioned this last time, Iro, the epigenetic switch, as you mentioned. And so what we know is if you induce enough environmental change that's right for the body, the genes switch expression permanently. And that holds, the changes will hold.
You said permanently?
Yeah, there is a permanent genetic change once you flip the switch.
Wow.
We've seen this in the work also in some autism kids, where we provide a broccoli seed extract product called sulforaphane. And it'll work on about 65% of kids where they're going to get better behavior. But in 1 out of about 30 kids, they're going to have a permanent change in behavior, even when the product's not being given to the kid. And so what the scientists are seeing and what we're seeing in the research is there's a permanent switch in the genetic kind of makeup of the body, and it turns on certain signals that will reduce the autistic behavior permanently, which is pretty interesting, right? And now what we're thinking scientifically is, what are all those epigenetic switches that we could now turn on and off to create optimal function? Food is a switch, but it's more transient. So, right, if you change your food, you'll feel better within probably the next 24 to 48 hours, all the way to 5 to 7 days. But yeah, there are things that make a permanent switch. I hope that helps. Interesting, right? I found it interesting when I was reading that stuff.
What's your approach, Mateo? Like now, because you do like serious weight cutting, I presume. Yeah, you're dealing with like some high level MMA guys, no?
Yeah, definitely. So like you alluded to a little bit earlier, MMA and jiu-jitsu weight cuts are pretty different. But I think that on either side of the token, you're kind of looking at the same issue, the same problem that you're trying to solve, which is this athlete walks around and they're in a state of fully saturated glycogen levels and full hydration, right? And that carries along with it, I think, similar to what the doctor was saying a little bit, kind of touching on a little bit, is it carries, certain activation of the sympathetic nerve, certain activation of the nervous system as far as force output goes to the muscle. So when we look at that from a strength and conditioning standpoint, one of the biggest things we can do as a strength coach, if we completely take out the side of, all right, I'm worried about their weight cut and I'm worried about their weight. If we're just thinking about how that weight cut is going to affect their power output or their performance gains that they've seen throughout a training camp, that's the main thing we're going to be worried about. When an athlete is highly depleted of their glycogen levels, the research will show that their nervous system kind of lowers force output a bit. And if we're talking about a guy who's, let's say he makes his living off, power punching, or he makes his living off being explosive, or anything that requires, that high power output or that high demand from the nervous system, taking that away from him is like taking away his best weapon, right? And obviously that's where, each athlete is different, and where we kind of got to look at the equation specifically each time. And we can't just say, okay, this athlete needs to cut in this way, because there are athletes that are coming into it with more of an aerobically centered fighting style. And that's going to be typically a little bit of an easier athlete to guide through a weight cut, because we can shift, especially through conditioning, through length of rounds, through recovery intervals, we can shift their training to represent more aerobic metabolism in this time. And just by switching to a fat-centered diet and controlling, the energy system that they're predominantly using, or that they're wasting, using most of their calorie expenditure throughout the day, then we can start seeing, glycogen levels drop, hydration levels, that were tied to that glycogen retention in the muscle will drop. Their weight will come off very easily, and performance decline, right? Because they're not heavily relying on those glycolytic, those I
think he cut out.
Yeah, he did.
Talk about a very, a Nick Diaz type of athlete that's kind of aerobically dominant. I'd say it's a little bit easier in that aspect. It's a little bit.
Yeah, I was actually gonna ask you to kind of explain that a little bit, because you're talking about two different athletes, and the first thing that came to mind was Nate Diaz and like Hector Lombard. It's like it's completely different. One is all power, the other one is does like triathlons. So obviously the weight cut approach is going to be completely different, because of the fact that Hector Lombard is 100% power. It's like he wins within the first 2 rounds. Otherwise, it's done. You know, he's gonna.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Doug.
No, I was gonna ask Mateo, do you guys do any blood work or urine work with your MMA guys?
So the thing is, if you have the athlete at a high level who has the funds and who has the, I guess, the budget to do something like that, where they're able to hire outside help, you know, go through the medical procedure, get blood work, it's ideal. And, you know, any strength coach will tell you that it'll make his job 10,000 times easier.
Oh, yeah.
With a lot of the level athletes, with a lot of the athletes that I work with, they just not at the point where they can financially, where they can, you know, from a health, you know, insurance or anything like that standpoint. So a lot of times it ends up being more guesswork. A lot of times it ends up being pretty subjective. And so, it, you know, it makes the process more difficult, but it also has to kind of make you in tune a little bit more with that subjective feedback and how they're feeling. Because, you know, and what I've tried to do in the settings that I can whenever I'm able to is to use any objective means in the weight room that I can to kind of see what those performance decrements look like. So anything, you know, from a maximal isometric hold of a grip strength test on a dynamometer, right? If that starts to decline, we're seeing, okay, let's start to think about maybe their strength levels or their glycogen levels are getting so low that we're seeing a decline because of that. Maybe it's just overall calorie deficits over the weight cut that are starting to get to them. Maybe it's not even just the glycogen. I have worked one training camp where I was able to get lactate concentrations in the training sessions, which helped a lot just because we were able to see if a typical training session was more aerobically or anaerobically heavy. Exactly. So that's very helpful. I think that could be like a low budget approach to doing it. Maybe something like a lactate tester along with you know, a spectrometer to read the urine to see if mineral levels are high. I think if any coaches out there looking to do anything in like the $500 to $800 range that could really step up their ability to help an athlete through a training camp, that might be the best tip as far as like technology from the strength and conditioning perspective. Obviously, you know, we don't have the blood sample analysis or anything, so it'd have to be more on the athlete side if they want to do it, you know?
Yeah, I understand. The only reason I bring it up is because I had shared a couple of articles with Iro the last time, and what some of the articles looked into, and these were studies I think done out of San Diego. I think San Diego has a pretty big jiu-jitsu community, and the studies were looking into the mitochondrial markers, so looking at energy markers across the blood work, across the organ systems, and they were actually able to track, I guess, increase in energy demand. And so my perspective then would be, if you're able to see how much energy demand this guy's looking for before the match, during the match, after the match, you can specifically give nutrient supplements to kind of boost him throughout all those segments, from B vitamins to carnitine, CoQ10, a lot of the stuff that are kind of under the radar, I think, right now of where athletes are being, I guess, trained into. And just my 2 cents on that. The other thing is, I think I will send you guys a link of a video with a nutritional physical exam. So it's free. It's on YouTube. It's on this website. It's an IFM, the Institute for Functional Medicine. And it's easy to pick up nutritional deficiencies from hair, skin, nails, tongue. And you can just, hey, can you show me your nails, man? You know, pick up on certain nutrients there and just correct it or you have it checked if they need to.
So I guess one thing that, I guess, coming from having been on both sides of the equation, having been both an athlete and being pretty self-sufficient in the fact that I try to kind of learn all these things myself when I was an athlete, and now knowing them a little bit more and working with athletes on the other side of it, I can tell you that one of the main things you'll start noticing as an athlete is, let's say about a week in, right? A week in, you've really cut down on your carbohydrates. You're starting to get a little bit concerned. Typical athletes, you're cutting, I'd say, 10 to 15 pounds into their weight class. And you're just starting to notice that late into the rounds, the performance decline happens a lot quicker. And you're also it's a lot more difficult for you to, let's just say the rate of perceived exertion on about everything you're doing significantly increases, right? So what I typically did in the past as an athlete was I would try to mitigate levels or very, low dips in the blood glucose throughout the day. So I wasn't tapping into the blood glycogen. Something that you kind of noticed, you talked about, and something I'd say I learned a little bit later on was this ability to switch into a ketotic state, which I think kind of, in my opinion, is a bit of a better approach, right? It's conserving glycogen when you don't need it. But my concern then is, or I guess my question or what I'm getting at is, if I'm teaching these athletes, or I'm training them, or I'm trying to get them to a ketotic state throughout most of the day, but then I'm putting them into a setting that's so heavily glycolytic, is that something that I should be concerned as a strength and conditioning coach, or even as a head MMA coach? Should I be more concerned of them starting to lose their ability to perform because they're going into it in this ketotic state? Or is that going to be a better scenario or a better situation compared to it, them being still carbohydrate reliant and just being so low in carbohydrates that over time it's just going to continue to decline and decline and decline?
It's funny. It's funny you bring that up. So and I about this last time I heard the mitochondria, right? Talking about the powerhouse of the cell. So that was in science class. We were in grade school. We probably learned that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And it's funny, that's actually what I work on with most of my patients, because I do treat post-stroke, autism, and all that. The way you're sharing to me the decline in function, right? The decline in I guess ability to focus, and decline in ability to do good training or work. For me, that screams mitochondria in the brain aren't getting enough energy.
Okay.
And so typically, there are two forms of energy, right? The muscle system uses creatine kinase, CKase, and so it powers that up to create that glycolytic pathway and create ATP from that setting. And mostly the muscles have a lot of that stored in them. The difference is the brain doesn't have that. The brain needs a stable supply of blood glucose. So sugar from your diet would go into the blood-brain barrier, give it into the brain, and then the brain would absorb and start to power up the mitochondria. So in the brain then would be the most sensitive to blood sugar fluctuations.
Okay.
Right? So once that blood sugar starts to fluctuate, your focus starts to wane. A pretty prime example of this is if you eat a very high carbohydrate meal, you'll get sleepy afterwards.
Yeah.
Simply because brain says, hey, there's too much sugar here, we're flooded. Pancreas will increase insulin drives it down just to control the sugar. Think of the training states that you've gone through and you guys are going through as fluctuating blood sugar in the brain. But there are research that shows that if you shift them into a ketogenic diet, the energy from fats will be more readily available and absorbable by the brain.
By the brain, okay.
By the brain, not the muscle system.
Okay.
And so now
that's kind of what I was getting at, yeah.
Yeah, so now you have like this like, I mean, the two paths to this. If you don't sustain with stable blood sugar, your focus comes down. But the muscle system is very strong with like the instant force of muscles needs a lot of glucose energy. And so there is a bridge between both. It's a stable protein status. And so my thoughts would be, and I don't know if there's any work done on this, would be you can shift to a ketotic state, but to maintain the strength in the muscle system, you need to have a set of free form amino acids that can be converted into energy at any given time. Because you are on a low calorie diet, but there will always be a system that will be sacrificed, because if you increase the carbohydrate load, then you won't switch into the fatty acid system, right? So then that becomes tricky. So my take on it is to have a higher macronutrient load.
Yeah.
You're eating more. You're eating more fats. You're eating more complex carbohydrates, and you have a form of free form amino acid powder that you're sustaining.
Yeah.
Because that's
positive
actually,
nitrogen balance essentially is what you're talking about.
That's
right?
actually the crux. So if you have a lot of different free form amino acids, arginine, lysine, in the setting that you lack energy, the body will convert those into energy. It won't be very efficient, but it is a way to bridge low glycemic loads in the brain.
Okay. Yeah, and I've seen that a little bit with the research on endurance athletes, and towards the end of the race, branched chain amino acid supplementation really helps kind of
it
mitigate
really
the power loss. Yeah, and that I've noticed with my guys. I like to keep them essentially when we go into these low carbohydrate states. So if I can kind of give you like a practical setting of how we apply that, would be try to elevate the blood glucose so that it's peaking as they're essentially hitting their warm up, as their sweat is starting to drip in their warm up, and that way we can kind of have that blood glucose fluctuation favor us when we go into the training session, but like you said, not take away from that brain energy throughout the levels. This I'm speaking of now as a coach, how I use it, using some of the principles you're talking about, rather than the kind of, in my opinion, mistaken way I used to do it, where I try to mitigate blood glucose a little bit more throughout the day. And so what I was saying was a small, solution of carbohydrates and branched chain amino acids throughout the training, and then I'll tail them off with 3-to-1 ratio of protein and carbohydrate to protein recovery drink, and then try to trail off on carbohydrates for the rest of the day, or even up until the next training session. So I think it's kind of like, just my strength and conditioning coach's way of applying what you're talking about, that concept in a practical setting.
Matches what the science is saying. I have a friend who takes I don't know if this is going to work for your setting, but there was this doctor that trained us. He's a functional medicine psychiatrist, and so these psychiatrist guys, they talk to the patients for about 4 hours. It's crazy 4 hours, and most of their patients are depressed, and most of the patients have mood disorders, right? So within about 2 hours, these patients get brain fatigue because they don't have a lot of energy in the brain. And so what he does is he does an experiment. At the start of the consult, he gives them a shot of MCT oil. And if by giving the shot of MCT, the focus is maintained for the 3 hours, then he knows that's a blood sugar, that's a energy dependent fatigue in the brain. Because
so the results have been that they do maintain the focus longer?
They start maintaining and so the question,
wow,
what he'd ask the patient would be, at 2-3 hour mark, do you feel like your focus is going away? And if the patient says, no, I feel fine, doc, then he knows it's an energy system issue. And so now he gives healthy fats. It's a fatty acid deficiency that's causing the brain fog and the reduction in focus, which kind of makes sense, right? Because we have these patients who have depression who are really nutritionally depleted. And the moment their blood sugar will swing, they'll get changes in focus and attention.
Yeah.
So I think that might be...
No, I think what you're saying is very interesting. And I think one of the main things that can make or break a strength and conditioning, from the strength and conditioning perspective, and when I talk about strength and conditioning, I really mean just more the performance of the athlete, right? Like looking, not just how their technique is starting to fall off, but just overall markers of performance. I think that one of the things that coaches do is they try to mix together performance training and weight loss training. And that's something that I picked up when I went to a seminar essentially at the Performance Institute for the UFC and in Las Vegas. And they talked about that. They have one of two modes they keep their athletes in. One is when they're trying to gain results in their performance. So they're trying to increase power, speed, anything attributed to that. And sometimes they'll put them in just a weight loss state. And that's all dependent on certain percentages away from their weight loss goals, right? And so one thing I think that when coaches have to make that switch from performance to weight loss, I think one of the main things that we can kind of look at from a strength and conditioning perspective and tie it into the whole what's going on with the nutrition aspect is keeping them out of high glycolytic zones for most of their training, really. And if they're going to do it in a setting where it's sparring, because they can't stop sparring and we can't really control what's going to happen in that setting. So if they're going to get into what they call the junk zone in endurance training, right? Because you have the high 190 plus heartbeats per minute, which they're not going to be able to sustain for very long, but they have that 160 to 180 beats per minute, or maybe even a little bit higher than that range, where they're burning through glycogen at a very high rate, but they're not seeing really any adaptations as a result of it, right? And if I'm as a strength and conditioning coach, if I'm putting them through intervals on the bike or intervals on the treadmill in that zone, I'm going to be depleting glycogen at a very high level in a time where I just can't afford to have that sort of an effect on the athlete. As a strength and conditioning coach, I'm trying to supervise sparring sessions and say that if they're in that 160 to 180 zone, usually obtained through subjective feedback of like an RPE, right? How are you feeling? 6 through 20. If they're in that 16 plus zone, or even through the, the talk test, if they can't speak a few consecutive
They
sentences,
can't even know.
right? That's sometimes the best we can do, but it can tell us, okay, I got 4 or 5 times that they couldn't pass the talk test. I know that they were heavily glycolytic for 30, 40 minutes. I might need a couple higher carb days to really, to really not put them in that kind of a, I guess you could call it like a energy dump or a really low carb blues, as some athletes call it. So just kind of throwing another couple little practical applications that we do to talk about some of the science that you're talking about.
That's actually, that ties together with a lot of the work that I do for patients with fatigue. So I have a number of patients actually with fatigue. These are high executives in big companies in the country. And what happens is they just burn through. They've been working in the company for 20 years, 15 years. They're kind of the vice president or whatnot. Then they burn through their energy stores. Their stress response is so high that the moment they go past their limit on a certain day from mental activity or exercise, and these guys are the AAA personality guys because they know they want to kind of grind it out. And what they see is that they just, after a day of just extreme work, they can't move the next day. It's just mental fatigue, physical fatigue. And they start going, "Doc, I can't move. I don't know what's happening to me." Like, okay, I think you did too much. And so there is this concept as well of fatigue recovery that we do. You're doing all the nutritional stuff, but also to inch your way forward. And so I don't know if you've had athletes who've burned out. There are a couple of athletes who have burned out. And this is true. Like what happens is they literally burn through their neurons and nutrients in the neuron, and then their ability to enjoy the work is just knocked out of them. And so those types of patients, I had a patient once, he couldn't even walk anymore. We asked him to start walking for 30 seconds per day. So he'd do a 30-second walk, then go back until we increased it all the way up to a 30-minute walk. And after about 3 months, he was able to drive his car again. But again, these guys are just so massively depleted. And if they knew about these concepts of stabilizing energy and kind of giving nutrients during the times that they were stressing out, I don't think they would have gotten to this chronically fatigued state that I had picked them up from at that point. Yeah, what's your experience with that though? I wanted to ask about burnout in athletes and what, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of personal experience and now a lot of secondhand experience with athletes I've worked with. Anything from delayed wound healing to loss of hair growth, nail growth.
Yeah, hair growth is one thing.
I've heard anecdotal evidence. I've heard anecdotal evidence. So I've a low immune response.
Mateo, back up again.
But one that I've heard of.
Back up. You speak out for just a second. Do it again.
No, sorry. I was saying that personally I've experienced like the delayed wound healing as kind of part of that burnout, the cumulative fatigue effect. But something I've heard of anecdotally is people actually blinking slower. I heard that in the context of somebody at the UFC Performance Institute was talking about one of the fighters that had to do a few fights kind of on short notice in a row, and they started seeing by the second or third weight cut that his blinking time was actually slowing down because of the
sounds like mitochondria, guys.
Exactly.
Gotta power those mitochondria.
and in my opinion, I think so much of it has to do with just this inability for the coach to pick up what they're really doing training session to training session. And for a guy like that, I think, you just got to think of a down-regulated nervous system for weeks on end, overreaching, not being met with the recovery protocols. So I think a lot of it, like you're saying, can be, tested from the nutritional standpoint. It can be preventive from the nutritional standpoint, but also it just becomes so much, you fan the flame so much as a strength coach or performance coach, or even as a head coach, by burying these guys in times when perhaps you're not looking at the big picture and the caloric deficit that they're going through,
Yeah.
So
I can imagine as well the way their hormones are kind of spiking up and down, because you need testosterone to build muscle. You need cortisol to get you in that fight mode whenever you're training or whenever you're in the event. And so these rise and fall of cortisol and testosterone would then create different metabolic demands. And so my other concern is that, for athletes who've retired, And so they have this pretty highly wired system. And I wonder how they're toning down as they kind of go through the last ages. I mean, I guess retirement age for martial arts, what, 30 years old, 35, 40 years old? Is that retirement for competition?
Yeah, depends on the weight class. Usually a heavier weight class is 35, lighter weight class is 30, 32, something like that. But yeah, I've seen a lot of that, like you said, a lot of changes over the years, and people still trying to get away with the same kind of protocols that they used to when they were younger, and it's just not working out for them.
Not gonna work.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think for that, like what you're saying, hormonal reasons are a big part of it.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you as well, as far as like temperature regulation, and as far as some of the things you can do from, you know, the caloric expenditure, you know, during rest, for example, or just, you know, what's going on outside of the training day. What kind of state do you want your athletes to be in? Because I remember a lot of times I would get, you know, overly cold just randomly, you know, a very, very hot room, and I just be freezing, you know, or even just, you know, difficulty kind of like with circulation sometimes, like hands would get numb easier, just things like that, to where I felt like, you know, temperature regulation and maybe blood flow were a little bit restricted.
That's common. I've actually heard.
Yeah,
that.
I don't know if that might be tied into the vasoconstriction from the cortisol release.
Well,
something, you know, maybe to be with to that extent.
So there are a couple of basic things I think that are left untested in everyone. We all get CBCs, complete blood counts, and typically doctors will read it as if high red blood cell count, low red blood cell count, etc. And they stop there. But what we know is that the red blood cell count, which carries oxygen throughout the body, will only deplete at a iron level of 20% and below. And so let's say for the normal iron or serum ferritin level is a level of 80, meaning at a level of 20, that's the only time your hemoglobin will go down. And so what I feel is happening to a lot of people is a functional iron deficiency. It's not an overt one, but it's pretty functional. And that's what's causing a lot of the kind of cold hands and feet. You mentioned temperature regulation, and that would always point toward a thyroid fluctuation. And so our thyroid is like the main kind of engine, right, of all the cells. You give thyroid hormone T3, it powers up all your cells. And so once the thyroid is suboptimal, you start getting a couple of different symptoms of low energy, high energy, low energy, high energy. And so there are nutrients to check for thyroid, but also there's simple tests. You can do a TSH test, free T4, free T3 test, and a reverse T3 test. We typically do this for a lot of our patients with chronic fatigue and hormonal imbalance. Also, to your point of changing programs as you age, super real. It's the same with nutrition. There is no right food for you forever, but there is a right food for you at this point in time. And so then you would then be shifting from one to the next. And as I mentioned to Ira the last time, I am a big proponent of test, don't guess, because when you test, then you know your level, then you know where you start. Even just for baseline, then you know where you are. Then you can work with it from a very intuitive perspective. I personally have had my stuff tested. I get thyroid test every year, get iron test every year. And I have issues with, so I had my gene test done as well. I have issues with clearing epinephrine in my brain. So there is a gene called MAO, and mine is subfunctional. And so my explanation will always be, if I ride a roller coaster, so we get happy for about 30 seconds, right? That boost of endorphins in my brain will kick for about 30 minutes before I can clear it out. I mean, that's the way I can explain it. And so if I get into a stress state, I'm in a prolonged stress state. If I get into an excited state, I'm in a prolonged excited state. But there are nutrients to help clear that from my brain. And so you could take any athlete, get these types of testing, even just a 23andMe would give that type of information. And you could start to really nitpick on how this person's body's working.
That's actually a good question. So what would you recommend then? Like what kind of, like you're saying, test, don't guess. What would you recommend would be like a good, like foundational test program saying, you know, get this, get this, get this. And
Yeah.
this
So
like
my
general
suggestion.
baseline.
My suggestion would be serum tests are very available. You do your annual physical anyway. The insurance can pay for it. What you ask for your doctor would be to check your complete blood count, look for your liver enzymes, look at the GGT. So there's a marker called gamma glutamyl transferase. That's the enzyme that produces glutathione in the body. Look at your iron panel, just so you know your iron levels are good. And then the homocysteine level. Homocysteine looks into the adequacy of B9 and B12, or this process called methylation. That's how your genes get switched off. That's kind of more the basic side. And look at blood sugar, of course, and then the thyroid. That test won't even cost $100, I think, maybe less than 100, maybe 150 at the most, but even less than that. If you have insurance, it should be free. Your GP should actually be ordering these things on a regular basis. The next test that I would suggest, if you have some funds, would be to run a genetic panel, 23andMe, and there are, once you get the data, there are computer software online that are free or you pay for it, and then they can get the raw data from 23andMe and then sift through a nutrigenomic assessment, a physical sports assessment, weight assessment, and then you can kind of figure out from there. The other one that I've seen is effective is running an organic acid test. This is a urine test that you collect the sample in the morning. It will pick up on nutrient markers as well as mitochondrial function, and if you've been storing toxins in the system. And then that's kind of the basic run. If you want to go a little bit deeper, you can get a fatty acid profile, and or you can do a heavy metal analysis, minerals, metals, and whatnot. If you run all these tests, so in the Philippines, if I would run this, probably cost organic acids about $500. The genetic test 23andMe is about, I think it's 179. The blood tests would be less than $100. Probably cost about 500 to $600 for the whole thing, and that's like the whole spectrum. If you want to go a little bit more advanced, and I think in the US it might be a little bit cheaper because you guys have the machines there, so we actually send the samples to you guys over there. But again, the interpretation would be
that's awesome. That's great information. Definitely something I think most athletes are looking for.
I was about to say that's something definitely beneficial for you, Mateo. It's something that
absolutely.
$600, you can basically do that like on an annual basis and like a framework for the whole year. Because I'm assuming most of your guys fight what, 2 to 4 times a year? Like how many fights are they having on an annual basis?
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit less as they go up, but yeah, ideally they're not doing more than that, right? Hopefully, just for their brain's sake, if it's MMA guys, if it's jiu-jitsu, you know, a lot of times, you know, maybe a tournament every couple months is a good average. But I think, what would you recommend, doctor? Maybe like a beginning of the competition season baseline test. And then
I think when you start training, you get the baseline when you start training. Then you know where they're starting from. Then you move them through training. If they have a little bit more funds, then you can repeat it after training, so you know how effective your training workout does. You can package it in a program where you're doing a before and after. Or if they don't have as much funds and you're doing it at the start of the year, then you just repeat it every year. Then you're gonna match the changes with the performance. Because you already have data, you know the baseline. You know what they're doing on a performance.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Levels, yeah.
Nice.
It's interesting stuff. I don't think this is as researched or this is as applied to the sports field. And I think that most sports, I guess, athletes think that it's pretty expensive. But really it's the investment. You're investing in the training anyway, right? So it kind of, if you put it as part of the component, then it's just part of the cost of how to get to the optimal level. You know, Ira there. It's like,
if you think about it, it's $50 a month.
Yeah, and something I tell the athletes all the time is, you know, that's the part that can make or break your training the most. So at the end of the day, if you don't get that right, you could be the best fighter in the world. You could have had the best training camp in the world. If you show up feeling like crap on fight day, and if you show up,
Oh yeah, shit.
you know, to that weigh-in, you know, knocking on death's door and your body's in the worst state possible, it's gonna be tough to get you back no matter what you did. So I think it's a worthy investment for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Any other?
That was interesting, guys.
This is super fun, guys. I'm having a good time.
I enjoyed that quite a bit. But most of these, I was telling Mateo at the beginning of this.
I agree.
Most of these studies, they like the consensus, or at least like what I was kind of got, like the overall theme was they really don't know for jiu-jitsu. It's basically that's basically the at least with jiu-jitsu, that's kind of like the theme was like we think this, but they need to test more of this. They would compare it to like judo and wrestling, but it's completely a different.
It's totally different,
It's
totally different sport,
so it's like one of those things where like, hopefully someone like Mateo and all of us are basically hopefully going to end up giving more and more information to.
Experience is still the king. That's what and Mateo, what you're experiencing, and Ira, what you're experiencing is still what will be the gold standard at the end of the day.
Cool. All right, guys.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, you guys stay safe.
Stay on the line, Mateo, real quick, okay?
Okay. Bye-bye, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, Doc.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.